The story you are about to hear is about student loans. It will explain why they feel heavier than you expected, why the balances often rise instead of fall, and why millions of people feel stuck in the same system. This video is designed to help you understand the truth in a calm and gentle way. You will learn how the loans are set up, how interest builds silently, what forgiveness programs really mean, and the steps that can bring you peace. The goal is not to scare you. The goal is to take something that has been a source of stress and explain it slowly until it feels clear. When you listen until the end, you will not only know the facts, you will also feel less pressure around them. You will hear stories, numbers, and examples that connect directly to the life you live. You will see why your situation makes sense, why you are not broken for having debt, and what small actions can change the weight you feel at night. We start with the emotional truth. For many people, the first notice about repayment arrives 6 months after graduation. They are often in a small apartment or living back at home. The job they worked so hard to find is paying less than they hoped. Then the bill arrives. $200, $300, sometimes more. The paycheck feels thin already. The bill feels impossible. This is the moment where shame begins to grow. People start to believe they did something wrong. But here is what the numbers show. Almost 45 million Americans have student debt. The average balance is around $20,000 to $25,000. Only a small percentage owe more than $100,000. So if you are carrying loans that feel heavy, you are far from unusual. The truth is that the system was designed to create this outcome. Tuition rose faster than wages. Loans were offered freely, often with little explanation of what interest would mean over years. You signed because it felt like the only way to move forward. That choice was not a mistake. It was a path almost everyone was told to take. Throughout this story, you will hear 3 kinds of lessons. First, the facts about how loans work, explained in soft and simple language. Second, the hidden costs that catch people by surprise, like capitalization of interest and the strict limits of forgiveness programs. Third, the emotional impact of carrying debt and the gentle ways to create relief. If you listen until the end, you will know the system better than most borrowers. You will also know how to carry the debt without letting it carry you. One of the biggest questions people have is why their balance grows even when they are paying. We will explain that clearly. Another question is whether forgiveness is real or a myth. We will cover what works, what fails, and what to expect. A third question is how to live life while the debt is still present. We will show how to budget in a way that creates freedom, not punishment, and how small steps change the emotional story. These answers matter because they replace confusion with clarity. You should stay with this story until the end, because the early parts explain the pain, the middle parts explain the system, and the later parts explain the healing. If you stop in the middle, you will feel the weight, but not the release. If you listen all the way through, you will carry knowledge that makes the weight lighter. You will see the whole path, from the fog to the redesign of your money story. That is the value this video offers. Let us walk through an outline of what you will hear. First, we talk about the quiet weight of debt. This part shows how it feels at the start. Then we map the maze of loans, explaining the difference between subsidized, unsubsidized, federal, and private. After that, we speak about interest, why it grows, and why balances climb. We also explain forgiveness programs and the truth behind them. These early chapters are about facing the reality clearly. In the next group of chapters, we move into the wake-up moments. We talk about income-driven repayment plans, what happens in default, and how deferment changes the picture. We also speak about the mental health impact of loans, the anxiety, and the late-night worry that so many people share. We then move into budgeting and show how a simple plan can make space for life while paying debt. These middle chapters are about shifting from confusion to control. The final group of chapters is about healing. We show how to use automation and apps to create peace of mind. We explain why minimum payments feel like running in place and how to reframe them. We gently correct myths that cause shame. We speak about generational misunderstandings and how to release guilt when older people say things that do not apply anymore. And finally, we close with rewriting your money story so you see yourself as more than a borrower. These last chapters are about peace, perspective, and freedom. Each part connects to the next. You will notice symbols and themes returning. The same fears that appear in the first part are resolved by the last. That is why staying through the whole video matters. It is not only information, it is a story of transformation, a slow journey that begins in fear and ends in calm. If you have ever felt like your debt defines you, this story will help. If you have ever wondered why the balance feels alive, this story will show you the math in plain language. If you have ever doubted forgiveness, this story will show you what is real. And if you have ever lost sleep over money, this story will give you the space to rest while still learning. Stay, because the truth is layered. In the beginning, we explain the surface pain. In the middle, we show the hidden system. At the end, we hand you the tools for peace. By the time the conclusion arrives, you will not only know more, you will feel different. The numbers may not change overnight, but your relationship with them will. That is the real freedom. The question is simple. Do you want to carry this weight the same way tomorrow as you did yesterday, or do you want to carry it with less pain? The answer is in the full story, and as we move into the first chapter, we begin with the quiet weight of debt. This is where everything starts. She lay awake in her small apartment. The streetlight slipped through the blinds. The room was quiet, but her chest felt heavy. Her phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line said, "Your student loan payment is due." She knew the message before opening it. The number would be there again, $247.22, the same amount every month. The paycheck was already stretched. Rent took the first cut, groceries the second. The bus passed the third. By the time the loan wanted its share, there was little left. She wanted to sleep. Instead, she scrolled back to the memory of signing the loan forms. She was 18. The office smelled like new paper and toner. Posters on the walls showed smiling students. The advisor told her not to worry. Everyone did it. Fill in the blanks. Sign here. College will pay for itself later. She wanted the chance, so she signed. She did not see the trap waiting. Now, years later, the papers had become a monthly wait. The balance was larger than she remembered. Borrowing, the interest grew like a slow leak. It did not matter that she worked. It did not matter that she paid. The balance did not shrink. The number in the email looked like a shadow she could not push away. She whispered to herself that she was not the only one. She had read online that 45 million Americans carried student debt. She had read that the average balance was about $20,000 to $25,000. She had read that only 10% owed more than $100,000. These facts should have comforted her. Instead, they felt distant. The shadow still pressed on her chest. She wanted to believe the payments would lead somewhere. She wanted to feel progress, but each time she paid, the balance looked the same. She thought, what am I doing wrong? The truth was simple. She was not doing anything wrong. The system was built this way. Tuition rose while wages stayed flat. Loans filled the gap. Interest grew in the background. What she felt was not failure. It was design. One night, she sat up and grabbed a notebook. She listed every loan. Loan A, $7,500. Loan B, $12,000. Loan C, $3,200. Total, $22,700 for the first time. The debt was outside her head. It was on paper. It looked smaller when written in ink than when floating in her chest. She stared at the page. It was heavy, but it was not infinite. She began to write more. She wrote her paycheck amount. She wrote her rent. She wrote food costs, bus costs, and the phone bill. Then she placed the loan line below them. The picture was tight, but it was a picture. It was no longer fog. She could see the numbers lined up like boxers on a shelf. The act gave her a breath of relief. She was still in debt. She was still behind on savings. But she had taken the shadow from her chest and placed it on paper. That was a small form of control. It mattered, she told herself. This debt is not me. It is only a number. Numbers change. The thought did not erase the balance. It did not make the email vanish. But it gave her one quiet night of rest. She kept the notebook by her bed. Each time the email arrived, she opened the notebook instead of panicking. She added the new payment to the page. She circled the total. It was still large, but each circle reminded her of progress. Her story was common. Millions of borrowers had done the same thing. Some ignored the bills until default. Some paid and paid without seeing change. Some looked for forgiveness. But all of them carried the same quiet weight at night. The weight was not only financial, it was emotional. It was identity. The truth was hard. Loans had become a silent roommate in her life. They took a share of every paycheck. They stood between her and her dreams. They told her to wait for the life she wanted. Still, she now had one tool: awareness. By writing the numbers down, she had opened a door. She had turned fog into lines on a page. She had given herself proof that she could face the shadow. But the notebook raised new questions. What were these different kinds of loans? Why did some grow faster than others? Why did some balances look unchanged while others jumped higher? She would need to map the maze, and that is where the next part of this story begins. She woke the next morning with the notebook still on the table. The pages showed her balances in ink. The act of writing them down had given her one night of peace. But now her eyes followed the small words next to each loan: direct subsidized, direct unsubsidized. Another from a private lender. If the balances were so different, then the labels must hold the reason why. She poured herself tea and sat quietly. She opened her laptop and searched for answers. The first lesson came quickly. A subsidized loan was the one the government supported while she was in school. The interest did not grow during those years. She felt relief when she saw that the balance for that loan matched the amount she had first borrowed. It was steady. It was like a friend who had waited for her to graduate before asking for repayment. Her eyes then moved to the next account, the unsubsidized loan. The difference was clear. This one had grown while she studied. Interest had been adding up in the background from the first day the money was sent to her school. During nights in the library and mornings rushing to class, the balance had been growing without her even seeing it. After graduation, the interest was added to the main balance. This explained why she owed more now than she remembered borrowing. It was not a mistake, it was how the loan was built. Then she turned to the loan from the private bank. This one had higher interest. The statement warned that the rate could change over time. It did not list options for special payment plans or forgiveness. The terms were clear and cold. You borrowed, you repay. There was no government safety net. This loan was the most demanding. It was also the one that had given her the least time to understand before signing. Back then, it had been the only way to cover the gap between tuition and her aid package. Now, it felt like a stone tied to her ankle. She wrote all of this into her notebook. She listed each loan, the type, and the rules she had learned: one steady but limited, one always growing unless she acted, one strict and private. For the first time, she could see that her debt was not a single block. It was a set of different pieces, each with its own path. She felt her shoulders drop as she understood it was not her failure that some balances rose while others did not. It was not random. The subsidized loan had been held for her. The unsubsidized loan had been charging quietly. The private loan had never offered protection. The rules were written before she had even stepped into her first class. She had only signed them without knowing how much they would matter later. Her mind drifted back to the counseling module she had clicked through at. 18, the screen had explained interest and repayment plans, but she had been focused on dorm supplies and new friends. The words had passed like water. She forgave that younger self. How could anyone truly understand the weight of $20,000 before earning a paycheck? She had signed with hope. That was not something to regret. Now she could see the loans as more than fear. They were lines on a map. She circled the private loan. This one was the highest cost. If she ever had extra money, this was where it should go first. She underlined the subsidized loan. This one was steady and could wait. She marked the unsubsidized loan as important, but not urgent. The map gave her a way to think. It was still heavy, but it no longer felt endless. She remembered stories she had read online. Borrowers who paid only minimums and saw no progress. Others who targeted one loan and celebrated small wins. The choice mattered. Seeing her loans divided gave her power. She could decide which path to walk. Even if she could not escape today, she could choose a direction. The tea cooled as she sat with her notebook. She whispered, "I can act, I do not have to only react." That thought gave her a new kind of strength. It did not erase the debt, but it made the shadow less dark. She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of her future self 5 years ahead. That self would thank her for paying attention now. That self would know the difference between a loan held steady, a loan that grew, and a loan that demanded more than the rest. That self would be glad she had seen the maze as a map. But as she looked at the totals again, a new question came. Why did the balances grow so quickly? What made the interest rise faster than her payments? How did the numbers climb even when she sent money every month? The map was clearer now, but the shadow of interest was still waiting at the next turn. And that is where the story must go next. The notebook now showed her 3 types of loans: one steady, one always growing, and one strict with higher rates. She felt calmer seeing them divided, but another thought pressed against her. Why did the balances feel larger each year, even when she paid on time? The answer was in the word she had always skimmed past: interest. She opened her statements again. Each payment listed 2 lines, one for interest, one for principal. At first, most of her money went to interest. Only a small piece lowered the actual balance. It felt like paying rent to a number that never left. She had sent thousands already, but the totals hardly moved. The truth was simple. Interest had been building every day since the loan was disbursed. She searched for examples. If you borrowed $5,000 at 5% interest, 1 year of school added $250. After the grace period ended, that unpaid interest was added to the balance. The loan became $5,250. Then the next year, interest was charged on the new total. That was capitalization. Paying interest on interest. The cycle was quiet but constant. She realized this was why her unsubsidized loan felt like a shadow that followed her. She had borrowed one amount but owed more by the time she graduated. The balance had grown while she studied for exams, while she worked part-time, while she tried to live like a normal student. It had never waited for her. It had always been awake. She thought back to the subsidized loan. That one had stayed the same because the government had paid the interest while she was in school. It explained why that balance looked unchanged. It was not kindness. It was a rule built into the system. She wished someone had told her clearly. Knowing earlier would have changed how she thought about borrowing. The private loan was even harsher. Its interest rate was higher than both federal loans. Some months it added nearly $100 to the balance before she paid anything. The rate could even change if the market shifted. She had signed the contract without realizing how much faster that loan would grow. She sat back and let the reality sink in. Her debt was not rising because she was careless. It was rising because the system was designed to grow. Interest was not a penalty. It was the cost built into every day of the loan's life. That cost would continue until the balance was gone. She remembered to fight back against the shadow. She remembered advice she had read: pay more than the minimum. Target the highest interest loan first. Every dollar above the interest line cut the principal directly. That reduced the future interest. Even a small extra payment, like $20, could save hundreds over time. She circled the private loan again in her notebook. That was the one stealing the most each month. If she ever had extra, still, she felt frustrated. How many years would it take? 10? 20? Longer if she only paid minimums. She thought of others she had read about. Borrowers who paid for years and owed more than they started with. Some had balances higher after 5 years than on the first day. The thought made her chest heavy again. She closed her eyes and breathed. She reminded herself that knowing the truth was better than fearing the unknown. Interest was not magic. It was numbers on paper. Numbers that grew in predictable ways. If she understood the rules, she could plan. That gave her more power than before. She opened her notebook and began a new page. She wrote, "Interest grows daily. Payments cover interest first. Extra money goes to principal. Pay the highest rate first." These were not complicated lessons, but they mattered. They were the key to shrinking the shadow over time. She remembered reading that new repayment plans had started to reduce how interest was handled. Some offered protection when payments were low. If her payment did not cover the full interest, the unpaid part would not be added to the balance. It gave borrowers a chance to stop the climbing totals. That idea gave her a sense of hope. Even the system was beginning to change. She sat quietly and let her thoughts settle. She no longer saw the debt as a shapeless monster. She saw it as a balance that responded to rules. It could grow, but it could also shrink. Each payment was not wasted. Each dollar slowed the shadow a little more. Over years, it would weaken. She felt lighter knowing this. The shadow of interest was still present, but it no longer felt endless. It was only math, and math could be managed with patience and time. Still, one thought remained. If interest kept growing, could forgiveness erase what was left? Was it true that after years of work or service, the balance might disappear? Or was forgiveness only a promise that few ever reached? That question would not leave her mind, and it is where the story must turn next. The thought of forgiveness lingered like a quiet question in her mind. She had heard stories about programs that could wipe away the balance after years of service or decades of payments. She had read news articles about people who celebrated when their loans were canceled and others who felt betrayed when their applications were denied. Forgiveness sounded like relief, but it also sounded uncertain. She opened her laptop again and typed in the words. Public service loan forgiveness appeared first. She learned that this program promised to cancel the remaining balance after 120 qualifying payments. That meant 10 years of steady monthly payments while working full-time for a government or nonprofit job. She thought about her own path. She had worked for a small nonprofit once, but she had never submitted the forms required to certify her employment. The rules were strict. Payments had to be on time. The loans had to be the right type. The repayment plan had to qualify. A single detail could disqualify years of effort. She read about teachers who could apply for a smaller forgiveness program after 5 years of teaching in certain schools. They could have up to $17,500 canceled. The idea of nearly half a balance disappearing sounded like a dream. But she also saw that not every school counted. Teachers often found out too late that their service did not qualify. She moved on to income-driven repayment plans. These plans promised forgiveness after 20 or 25 years of payments. The monthly amounts were based on income, sometimes even dropping to zero for people with low wages. The idea was both hopeful and heavy. 20 years felt like forever, yet it also offered a guarantee that the debt would not last for life. The thought that one day the balance would simply be erased gave her a sense of relief. Still, she learned that in the past, the forgiven balance might have been taxed as income. That meant borrowers could face a new bill in the year they celebrated. She wrote a note in her notebook. Forgiveness brings freedom, but also rules. She paused and let her shoulders relax. The programs were real. They were written into law. They had canceled billions in loans for hundreds of thousands of borrowers, but they were also narrow and filled with conditions. Forgiveness was not a magic key that opened for everyone. It was a door with locks that needed the right keys in the right order. She thought about her own options. She did not work in public service now. She was not a teacher. The path most open to her was income-driven repayment. It would not erase the debt quickly, but it would protect her from drowning. She whispered to herself, "It is not fast, but it is a promise." That thought softened her chest. She remembered stories of people denied forgiveness after years of effort. Some had made 120 payments, but were told they were on the wrong plan. Others had loans that were not eligible. The fear of wasted time was real. Yet she also read about recent changes. Temporary waivers had expanded eligibility. More borrowers were finally seeing their balances disappear. It showed her that persistence mattered. The system was flawed, but it was shifting. She closed her eyes and imagined the day when her balance reached zero. Whether through steady payments, forgiveness, or both, the outcome was possible. That picture gave her hope. It was far away, but it was real. She added another line in her notebook. Forgiveness is real, but rare. It requires rules, patience, and record keeping. She decided that if she chose that path, she would be careful. She would keep every statement, every form, every confirmation. She would not let a missing record take away her chance. She felt calmer now. Forgiveness was not a myth. It was not guaranteed either. It was an option with conditions. Knowing that truth steadied her. It meant she had more than one way forward. But the question remained. If forgiveness took decades, how would she manage the weight in the meantime? She needed a way to make payments match her income without collapsing under the pressure. That answer was waiting in the details of repayment plans, and that is where her story must go next. The thought of forgiveness was comforting, but it still felt far away. 10 years of service or 20 years of payments stretched across nearly half a lifetime. She needed something that could help her now, something that would make tomorrow's payment less frightening and tonight's sleep a little deeper. That was when she kept seeing one phrase appear in her searches, income-driven repayment. The words sounded formal, but she sensed there was something important in them. She remembered the number on her last statement. Almost $300 was due every month on the standard plan. Each time she saw it, her stomach turned. Rent was already half her paycheck. Food, transportation, and the phone bill left little room for anything else. The loan payment felt like an impossible demand. But what if there was a way to link the payment to her actual income? What if the system could recognize her real life instead of forcing her into a number she could not sustain? She read slowly through the details. Income-driven repayment, or IDR, was a group of plans offered on federal loans. The promise was simple. The payments would be tied to income and family size instead of the original loan balance. If her earnings were modest, the payment could fall to a level that did not break her budget. In some cases, it could even be calculated at zero without penalty. Each payment, even the smallest one, would still count toward long-term forgiveness. Her chest lifted when she thought about that. She pictured logging into her portal, selecting a plan, and seeing her monthly payment drop from almost $300 to something she could manage. She whispered softly, "I can do this. I can afford this." That sense of possibility was more powerful than she expected. She learned that several types of income-driven plans existed. Some capped payments at 10% of discretionary income. Others asked for 15%. Discretionary income was defined as what you earned above a basic living allowance. That meant the system acknowledged that you needed money for food, shelter, and survival before debt. She realized that with her current salary, her payment might fall under $100. The number made her shoulders relax. It was still a payment, but it was no longer a threat. She wrote in her notebook, "Apply for IDR." She circled the line twice. It was the first concrete action that seemed within reach. She felt a calm kind of determination, not excitement, not fear, but something steady. It was the feeling of a step that could actually hold her weight. Her research showed her one more detail. Enrolling was not something she could forget about after the first time. She would need to recertify every year. That meant submitting her income again so the payment could be recalculated. If she ignored it, the system would push her back to the higher standard payment. She pictured how much that would hurt if she forgot. She wrote another note in the margin. Mark calendar every year. She promised herself she would not let a missing form take away her peace. She then came across information about the newest plan, Save. This plan had one feature that made her pause. If her monthly payment was too small to cover all the interest, the leftover interest would not be added to the balance. That meant even if she paid less than the interest due, her balance would not grow. For the first time, she understood that a small payment could keep her steady instead of pushing her deeper into debt. That one rule gave her the gift of stability. She closed her eyes and imagined her life with this change. She would still owe money, but the number would not balloon out of control. She would pay what she could each month, and time itself would carry her closer to forgiveness. It was not fast, but it was safe. She could breathe again. Then she looked at her private loan. A quiet sigh escaped. The protections of income-driven repayment applied only to federal loans. The private lender would still demand its fixed monthly amount. No adjustment for income, no forgiveness at the end. It made her notebook feel heavier again, but she realized the relief on her federal loans still mattered. If she lowered those payments, she could focus her strength on the private balance. The map she had drawn now had new paths. She remembered reading about borrowers who resisted signing up. Some thought paying less was a sign of weakness. Some feared they would never pay off their loans if they lowered their payments. She felt those doubts too. But then she reminded herself of the truth. Income-driven repayment was not an escape. It was a program built into the system to prevent default. It was a way to stay afloat while still moving toward freedom. Every payment counted, even the smallest ones. Every month kept her in good standing. She thought of how many people must have suffered in silence before learning about this option. She thought of nights wasted in panic when a lower payment could have been possible. She pressed her hand gently on the notebook and whispered, "I am allowed to ask for help." That thought brought her comfort. She pictured her next steps clearly. She would open the federal loan portal. She would click on the application for income-driven repayment. She would enter her income and family size. She would select the plan that gave her the lowest payment. And when the new number appeared, smaller and softer than before, she would finally sleep without the same fear. Her breathing slowed. She felt a new kind of safety. The debt was still there, but the weight had shifted. She no longer saw a cliff. She saw a bridge. But then a question formed that would not leave. What if something happened tomorrow? What if she lost her job? What if illness or crisis struck and she could not pay even the reduced amount? Would the lifeline of income-driven repayment be enough, or would she fall back into the shadow of default? That question pulled her forward into the next part of her story. The comfort of income-driven repayment gave her a new sense of safety. The thought that her payments could match her income made the burden feel lighter, but the calm did not last long. She realized that even with a lower payment, life could still bring moments where she could not pay anything at all. What if her job ended suddenly? What if illness or family needs drained every dollar she had? The worry returned. She needed to know what would happen if her lifeline slipped from her hands. She opened her notebook and wrote a new question. What happens when you cannot pay at all? She wanted to face the answer directly, no matter how heavy it sounded. She searched through her loan servicer's website and read slowly. She saw the word deferment. She saw the word forbearance. She saw the word default. Each one carried its own meaning. Each one was a stage in what could happen if life pushed her too far. She started with deferment. It meant pausing payments for a time if you qualified. If you were unemployed, or in school again, or serving in certain programs, you could ask for a break. Subsidized loans would not grow interest during deferment, but unsubsidized loans would. She felt relief that the system offered a pause, but also disappointment that, even in rest, some balances would keep rising. It was like being allowed to stop running while the road stretched longer in front of you. Then she read about forbearance. This was another way to pause payments, but it was more limited. Interest would always build, even on subsidized loans. It was often granted for hardship, but it came with a cost. Many borrowers used it again and again, stacking months of unpaid interest onto their balances. Some had watched their debt double from repeated pauses. She shivered at the thought. She wrote a note to herself. Forbearance can help, but it must be temporary. She then faced the hardest word, default. It meant failing to make payments for a long time, usually 9 months. The consequences were harsh. The full balance could be demanded at once. Tax refunds could be taken. Wages could be garnished without court approval. Credit scores could collapse. She pictured that happening and felt her stomach sink. The fear of default was what had kept her awake so many nights. It was the shadow she wanted most to avoid. But then she saw something else. She read that even after default, there were ways back. Rehabilitation, consolidation, to paths that could restore loans to good standing. Rehabilitation meant making a series of affordable payments, often as low as $5 or $10 based on income, for 9 months in a row. After that, the default mark could be removed. Consolidation meant taking a new loan to pay off the old one with a promise to enroll in income-driven repayment. It would not erase the history, but it would stop collections and bring the account current. She felt a flicker of hope. Even the worst outcome was not permanent. There was still a ladder out of the hole. She leaned back in her chair and breathed. The words deferment, forbearance, and default were no longer distant terms. They were real paths that people took when life stopped their payments. Each one carried risks, but each one was also a tool. Knowing them was better than fearing them in silence. She thought about Lily, a borrower she had read about. Lily had lost her job and ignored her loan letters until default set in. Her wages were garnished and her tax refund was taken. But then she learned about rehabilitation. She agreed to pay a small amount each month. 9 payments later, her loans were back in good standing. She cried when she saw the word current on her statement. The road was long, but she was walking it again. She then thought about John, another story she had found. He had chosen deferment when he was unemployed. It gave him 12 months of relief, but his unsubsidized loans kept growing. When payments restarted, the balance was higher. He felt regret, but he also felt grateful that he had survived that year without default. The lesson was clear. These tools were not gifts. They were trade-offs. They kept you afloat, but they asked a price. She placed her hand on the notebook. She whispered, "If life stops me, I know the choices. I can pause, I can recover, I can begin again." That knowledge eased the fear of the unknown. She could not control the future, but she could prepare for it. Still, the weight of all this stirred something deeper in her. It was not only about payments and balances, it was about how the debt lived inside her mind. The late-night worry, the racing thoughts, the feeling of shame when she compared herself to friends. She realized the loans were not only a financial burden, they were an emotional one too. And that is where the story must go next. She now understood the rules of deferment, forbearance, and default. Knowing those paths gave her some peace, but peace only lasted for a short while. The weight of her loans did not live only in her bank account. It lived in her body. It pressed on her chest at night and echoed in her thoughts during the day. The debt had become part of her inner world, shaping how she felt about herself and her future. She thought about how many nights she had stared at the ceiling, her heart racing over the thought of missing a payment. Even when she made every payment on time, the anxiety stayed. It was not only about money, it was about safety. Debt made her feel unsafe in her own life. It was a constant reminder that she owed something to someone, that her choices were limited until the balance was gone. She began to notice how the weight showed up in small ways. She avoided opening emails because she feared another notice. She skipped gatherings with friends because she did not want to spend money she did not have. She compared herself to people her age who bought homes or took vacations, and she felt behind. The shame was quiet but steady, like a shadow following her from room to room. She read a survey that said 4 out of 5 borrowers reported feeling anxious about their student debt. Nearly half said they had felt hopeless because of it. Some had even thought about ending their lives. She sat with those numbers and realized her feelings were not rare. They were common. Millions of people carried the same heavy thoughts at night. Knowing this gave her a strange comfort. Her struggle was not a sign of weakness. It was a reflection of a system that burdened many. Still, the emotional weight did not lift easily. She remembered one morning when her card was declined at the grocery store. The embarrassment stayed with her for weeks. She had enough in her account, but the hold from her loan servicer had caused the problem. To anyone else, it was a small mistake. To her, it felt like proof that she was failing. She began to see how debt changed her choices. She delayed seeing a doctor because of the cost. She held off on saving for retirement because every dollar felt claimed by her loans. She wondered if she should wait to start a family, to buy a home, to dream about travel. Each thought ended with the same barrier: not until the debt is gone. One evening, she wrote in her notebook again. This time, she did not write numbers. She wrote feelings: fear, shame, anger, tiredness. Then she wrote hope. She looked at the words on the page and realized the debt was more than financial. It was emotional. By writing the feelings down, she pulled them out of the shadows of her chest. She thought of Nina, a story she had read about a young professional who cried every time she checked her loan balance. Nina earned a good salary, but the debt still made her feel trapped. It showed her that income did not erase the emotional burden. Debt carried weight beyond numbers. She realized she needed tools for her mind as much as tools for her bank account. She began with something simple. She set a rule that she would check her loan accounts only once a month, not every day. Limiting the time she spent staring at balances helped her breathe more freely. The loans still existed, but they no longer controlled her daily mood. She also started talking openly with a friend about her debt. At first, she was afraid of judgment, but her friend admitted they carried loans too. They shared stories, fears, and small victories. Speaking aloud reduced the shame. Silence had given the debt more power. Sharing it made it lighter. She read about the way stress from debt can affect health: higher blood pressure, trouble sleeping, strained relationships. It made sense. She felt those effects in her own life. But knowing that debt stress was studied and real reminded her she was not imagining it. Her body was reacting to a constant weight. She could begin to care for herself in small ways, even before the loans were gone. She began practicing small moments of calm each day: 5 minutes of slow breathing, a short walk without headphones, a reminder that life was still bigger than her debt. She wrote in her notebook, "Debt is part of my life, but it is not all of my life." Slowly, she began to feel the difference between carrying debt and being defined by it. Carrying debt was a challenge. Being defined by it was a prison. She wanted the first truth, not the second. She was more than a balance owed. She was a person with skills, hopes, and a future. But even as she learned to ease the emotional weight, the practical question returned. How could she create a plan for her money that included her loans without stealing her life away? She needed a way to live while paying, not only wait until the last payment to start living. That question guided her hand as she closed her notebook for the night. The next page would not be about fear. It would be about building a plan that gave her space for joy, even with loans still present. And that is where the story will go next. She had faced the emotions that came with her loans. She had admitted to the fear and shame. She had written the words down in her notebook and felt lighter for naming them. But as she sat with those feelings, another truth rose inside her. Knowing the emotions was not enough. She needed a plan. a plan that would let her live now while still paying her debt. She did not want to wait 20 years to breathe. She wanted to breathe today. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the title, My Money Plan. She listed her income at the top, the amount that arrived in her account each month after taxes. Below that, she began to write her expenses: rent, groceries, transportation, phone, internet, and the loan payment. The numbers were plain and simple. Yet when she saw them in one place, she finally understood where her money was going. The fog that had hung over her spending began to clear. She remembered a rule she had read about called 50-30-20, 50% for needs, 30% for wants, and 20% for savings and debt. She tried to apply it to her own numbers. Her needs took more than half, her wants less than 30, and her debt filled almost all the space for savings. She frowned at the page, but did not feel defeated. This was her truth. The rule was not a cage, it was only a guide. She could adjust it to fit her life. She asked herself what mattered most. She needed shelter and food. She needed to cover transportation so she could work. The loans had to be paid to stay in good standing, but she also wanted space for small joys. Cutting out every want would make her feel punished. She decided she would allow herself a small fund for fun, even if it was only $20 a month, enough for a meal with a friend or a small gift for herself. She wanted her plan to feel human, not harsh. She looked again at the private loan with the high interest. She circled it in red. She decided that whenever she had extra money, even a small amount, she would send it there. She knew it would save her more over time than adding extra to the other balances. This was her way of choosing her path through the maze, one step at a time, one payment after another. She would weaken the heaviest loan first. She also thought about the timing of her payments. Rent was due at the start of the month, and it always took a large share of her paycheck. If her loan payment was due on the same date, the pressure was unbearable. She called her loan servicer and asked to change her due date. To her surprise, they agreed. She moved it to the middle of the month after her second paycheck. That one change gave her more breathing room. The numbers stayed the same, but the timing gave her space to manage. She added another note in her plan, set up automatic payments. The servicer had told her that enrolling in autopay gave her a small interest discount, about 0.25%. It did not sound like much, but every dollar saved mattered. More importantly, autopay would prevent her from missing a payment by accident. It would keep her credit safe. She wrote it down as a promise to herself. She wanted her plan to be realistic, not a fantasy. So she added lines for irregular costs, gifts during holidays, car repairs, doctor visits. She knew surprises were part of life, and if she ignored them, they would only lead her back to using credit cards. She estimated small amounts for each category and set them aside in her budget. Even if she could only save $10 a month for emergencies, it was a start. As she wrote, she realized something important. The plan was not only about debt, it was about balance. It was about making space for both responsibility and joy. It was about making choices instead of letting the debt make them for her. She could no longer see her loans as endless walls. They were lines in her plan, no different from rent or food. She smiled at the page. For the first time, she felt she had a map that belonged to her. It was not perfect. It would change as her life changed, but it was hers. That gave her a sense of power she had not felt before. She closed her notebook and leaned back. The silence of the room felt softer now. She thought of how many people carried loans without ever writing down their own plan. How many lived in constant reaction instead of quiet control. She felt proud that she had taken this step. Still, she knew there was more she could do. She had her plan on paper, but what if she could make it easier to follow in daily life? What if tools existed to remind her, track her, and even save for her without effort? She wondered if technology could offer her help. That question lit a small spark inside her. It was the thought of using tools beyond her notebook, tools that might bring even more calm into her days. And that is where the story will go next. The notebook gave her a plan, but she knew herself well enough to understand that a plan on paper was only the beginning. Life was busy. Bills came fast, distractions were endless. She wanted something that would keep her steady even when she felt tired or overwhelmed. She wondered if there were tools that could do some of the work for her. She remembered how her bank app sent her alerts about balances. At first, those messages had felt like alarms, but then she saw how useful they were. A small reminder at the right time stopped her from overspending. She thought about her loans in the same way. Maybe there were tools that could remind her, guide her, or even move money for her without asking. She began to search for options. The first was autopay through her loan servicer. She had already noted this in her notebook, but now she understood its value even more. Enrolling meant never missing a payment by accident. It meant her loan would always be current. It also gave her a small interest discount. Even 0.25% mattered over the years. Autopay was not only convenient, it was a safeguard against mistakes when her mind was tired. She then found apps built specifically for debt repayment. Some rounded up purchases and sent the change toward loans. A coffee for $3.50 became $4 charged, with 50 cents moving quietly toward debt. She thought about how small amounts felt meaningless when saved on their own, but added up over time, they could shorten her repayment by months. These roundup apps acted like silent helpers. They worked in the background without needing her constant focus. Another type of app created plans for debt payoff. She could enter all her loans, balances, and interest rates. The app would show her how long each option would take. It could compare paying the smallest loan first, called the snowball method, or paying the highest interest loan first, called the avalanche method. The visuals made the path clearer. She liked the thought of seeing progress as charts and milestones instead of only numbers on a screen. She also looked at budgeting apps that connected all accounts in one place. These gave a full picture of income, expenses, and balances. They made patterns easier to spot. She realized she often forgot about small subscriptions that drained her money. An app could flag them and give her the choice to cancel. Each small saving could be redirected to her debt. It was another way of making her plan stronger with less effort. The more she explored, the more she saw that technology was not about replacing her discipline. It was about supporting it. It was about removing the friction that made repayment harder. She thought about how many times she had forgotten a due date or delayed logging in to check her balances. These tools could step in where her energy was thin. They could hold her accountable in gentle ways. She also considered security. Linking bank accounts to apps made her nervous. But she read reviews and saw that many were trusted by large financial institutions. She decided she would start small. She would choose one app for tracking, one for budgeting, and rely on autopay for the payments themselves. Too many tools would overwhelm her. The goal was calm, not clutter. As she imagined her new system, she felt relief. She would still write in her notebook because it grounded her. But now, she would also have reminders on her phone, charts that showed progress, and small automatic payments that chipped away at her balances. Together, these would make her journey less about constant vigilance and more about steady habits. She smiled as she pictured opening an app and seeing her debt shrink, even by a little, and being reminded that her efforts mattered. The numbers might not change overnight, but the feeling of progress could be immediate. That feeling was fuel. It would keep her steady through the long years ahead. Still, she knew that even with apps and autopay, repayment was a long road. Many months, she would send her money and see almost no change in the total. That truth had already worn her down in the past. The emotional cost of sending payment after payment while the balance seemed frozen was real. She wondered how she could carry that without losing hope. And that question is where her story must go next. The apps and tools gave her structure. The notebook gave her a sense of order. The automatic payments gave her safety. Yet when she looked at her balances each month, a quiet frustration grew. She sent her money faithfully, but the numbers hardly moved. It felt like she was running in place. She was working hard, but the finish line never came closer. She opened her statement and traced the lines with her finger. Out of the $300 she paid, almost $200 went to interest. Only $100 reduced the balance. She thought of the hours she spent working for that money and how little of it actually cut into the debt. She felt like a bucket catching water, while a hole at the bottom kept it from filling. The numbers left her drained. She remembered reading that this was the experience of many borrowers. They made minimum payments for years, yet their balances stayed almost the same. Some even saw their totals rise. It was not because they were careless. It was because interest grew faster than their payments could shrink it. The truth was harsh. Minimum payments were designed to stretch repayment over decades. That meant decades of living with the shadow. She sat back and closed her eyes. The feeling was heavy, but she forced herself to breathe. She reminded herself that even when progress felt invisible, it was still real. Every payment prevented the balance from growing larger. Every month kept her loans in good standing. She was not failing, she was holding steady. And holding steady mattered. She began to think of ways to make the progress more visible. She created a small chart in her notebook. Each time she made a payment, she colored in a square. Even if the balance barely moved, the chart filled slowly. The visual gave her a sense of motion that the numbers alone did not show. It reminded her that persistence was its own form of success. She also started celebrating milestones that felt small to others but meaningful to her. The first 500 paid the first 1,000. The moment the private loan balance dropped under 10,000, these markers became moments of encouragement. They showed her that repayment was not only about the final day of freedom, it was about steady steps along the way. She still worried about how long it would take. 20 years felt endless. She wondered if she would be in her 40s or 50s before the shadow lifted. Yet she realized something important. Time would pass either way. She could carry the debt and do nothing, or she could carry it and keep chipping away. The second path at least gave her direction. She thought of David, a story she had read about another borrower. He had paid the minimum for years and grew hopeless when the balance stayed high. But then he found a new approach. He sent even $10 extra whenever he could. Over time, those small amounts reduced the interest owed and shortened his term. It did not feel like much at first, but when he looked back 5 years later, he had saved thousands. The lesson stayed with her. Small steps added up when repeated. She wrote a new note in her notebook. Progress is slow, but it is progress. Do not stop. That line became a mantra she repeated when the frustration rose. It calmed her when she felt trapped. She also reflected on the emotional cost of waiting for freedom. If she told herself she could only live once the debt was gone, she would waste years in misery. She decided she would not wait. She would build small joys into her life while paying. She would not let the loans steal her present in the name of a future. That shift made her shoulders relax. Still, she could not ignore the myths that surrounded her. People often told her that student loans were easy to pay off if she was disciplined. Others claimed forgiveness was a scam. Some even said that debt was a sign of laziness. These words hurt. They made her doubt herself even when she was doing her best. She realized that part of her burden was not only the numbers, but also the myths that people spread. And that realization set the stage for what she needed to face next. The lies that surrounded student debt, the stories that made borrowers feel shame when they deserved compassion. The feeling of running in place had left her drained. But what stung even more were the voices around her. Some came from strangers online. Some came from family or coworkers. They all carried opinions about her debt, spoken as if the story were simple. Those words grew into myths that made her question her own worth. Myths that whispered she was careless. Myths that told her the loans were her fault alone. She began to realize that carrying the debt was hard enough, but carrying the myths made it heavier. The first myth she often heard was that student debt was easy to pay off if you tried. She thought about her own budget and shook her head. She worked full-time. She cut costs where she could. Yet her payments still barely touched the balance. She knew millions were in the same position. Wages had not kept up with tuition. Borrowing had become a requirement for many, not a choice of luxury. Believing this myth only created shame where there should have been understanding. Another myth was that forgiveness was a scam. People said no one ever qualified, that the rules were too strict. She thought about the facts she had read. Thousands had already seen their loans canceled through forgiveness programs. It was not a fantasy. It was real, though imperfect and often difficult to access. Spreading the myth that forgiveness never happened stole hope from those who needed it most. She also heard the myth that student debt meant someone had studied something useless. People mocked borrowers for choosing majors in the arts, education, or social sciences. Yet she knew the truth. Many with large debts were nurses, teachers, or public servants. They had chosen fields that served society, but offered modest pay. Debt was not proof of wasted study. It was proof of a system that tied opportunity to borrowing. Another myth was that young people were entitled for wanting help with their loans. She thought of how older generations often repeated that line. But she also knew that tuition had been far lower in the past. Many parents had attended college when costs were a fraction of what they were today. Loans had not been required at the same scale. This myth ignored how much the system had changed. It compared to different worlds as if they were the same. She wrote each of these myths in her notebook. Beside them, she wrote the truth. Myth: student debt is easy to pay. Truth: balances rise even for those who pay. Myth: forgiveness is fake. Truth: forgiveness has already freed many. Myth: loans mean wasted study. Truth: essential workers carry them too. Myth: debt means entitlement. Truth: costs grew while wages stayed flat. Seeing the words side by side gave her strength. She thought about how dangerous myths were. They shaped how borrowers felt about themselves. They silenced people into shame. They discouraged them from seeking options like income-driven repayment. They kept people isolated when they needed community. Myths acted like invisible chains, heavier than the loans themselves. Breaking them was as important as making payments. She remembered a conversation with her uncle at a family dinner. He had said, "Why don't you just pay them off faster? Skip eating out and it will be done." She had smiled politely, but inside she had felt small. She wished she could have shown him her notebook. She wished he could see how little was left after rent, groceries, and minimum payments. The myth, in his words, was clear. He thought discipline was the only barrier. The truth was that income and interest were the real forces. She decided that when she heard myths again, she would remind herself of the truths she had written. She would no longer carry other people's misunderstandings as if they were facts. She would replace their words with her own knowledge. That was a new kind of repayment, not of money, but of dignity. She also began to think about how myths created divisions between generations. Parents who never had to borrow judged children who did. Older workers who paid off smaller loans dismissed the struggles of younger ones. The myths built walls where there should have been bridges. She wondered what it would feel like if families spoke with compassion instead of judgment. If society treated debt not as a mark of failure, but as a shared challenge to solve. She closed her notebook and placed her pen on top. Myths had lost some of their power. She had faced them with truth, yet she knew they would return. Each time someone spoke without understanding, the shame could rise again. The real task was learning to hold her own ground. Still, her thoughts wandered to something deeper. Myths hurt, but so did silence within families. She began to realize that the way different generations spoke about money shaped how people felt about their own debt. Many carried guilt because they felt they had failed their parents' expectations. Others carried confusion because money had never been spoken of at all. She wanted to explore how those family voices shaped her own story, and that is where her journey now turns. She had learned how myths shaped her view of debt. She had written them down and replaced them with truths. But myths were not the only voices that weighed on her. There were also the voices of family. The way older generations spoke about money often deepened her shame. She began to see that debt was not only a financial struggle, but also a bridge, or sometimes a wall, between generations. At family gatherings, conversations about money felt heavy. Her parents spoke about how they had worked their way through school with part-time jobs and graduated without loans. They reminded her that tuition had been affordable when they were young. They believed hard work alone was enough. She listened, but she felt misunderstood. She worked hard too, but the cost of her education was far greater than what they had faced. Their experience and hers were not the same, yet their words carried judgment. Her grandparents often echoed the same message. They believed borrowing for school was unnecessary. They thought debt meant waste or poor choices. She wanted to tell them that tuition had climbed faster than wages, that loans were often the only way to access higher education. But each time she tried, she felt the wall between them grow taller. She carried her silence instead. That silence became another burden. She thought about friends who had shared similar stories. One friend said his father refused to talk about money at all. Another said her mother scolded her for choosing a major that did not lead to a high salary. Some were told they had made their beds and now had to lie in them. The words may have been meant as lessons, but they landed as shame. Borrowers carried not only the debt, but also the weight of disappointing those they loved. She opened her notebook and wrote a new heading: Family Voices. Beneath it, she listed the words she remembered from her parents, her grandparents, her uncles, and her aunts. Then she wrote her own quiet response to each one. To the comment that she should have worked harder, she wrote that no part-time job could cover tuition that had doubled in a generation. To the suggestion that her degree was not worth it, she wrote that education had given her opportunities, even if the debt was heavy. To the silence about money, she wrote that hiding the subject only made confusion worse. Seeing her own words on the page gave her strength. She realized she did not need her family's approval to validate her experience. Their voices were part of her story, but they were not the final word. She could choose to listen to them with compassion and still hold on to her truth. She thought of how healing it might be if families shared honest conversations about debt. If parents explained the differences between their time and today, if grandparents listened to the stress that younger borrowers carried. She believed that bridges could be built, but only if myths were replaced with empathy. Until then, she would carry both the debt and the silence. One evening, she gathered the courage to speak to her younger cousin, who was preparing for college. She told him what she had never heard when she was his age. She explained the types of loans, the way interest grew, the choices he might face. She did not tell him to avoid debt at all costs, nor did she say it was easy. She gave him knowledge instead of silence. In that moment, she broke the chain of myths that had bound her. She began to see that rewriting her money story was not only about paying her loans, it was about changing the way she spoke about them, both to herself and to others. She could not erase the past, but she could change the future by being open, honest, and kind in her words. As she closed her notebook, she realized something important. Debt had shaped her, but it did not define her. She was allowed to write a new chapter where her identity was larger than her balance. She was ready to release the shame that had been passed down and replace it with her own voice. Still, the question remained. If she was not defined by her debt, then who was she? What story could she tell about herself that was not tied to what she owed? She felt a quiet pull to explore how to rewrite her own story, one line at a time, until her debt was only a chapter and not the whole book. And that is where her journey must go next. She had spent years listening to voices outside of herself. Myths from society, judgments from family. Silence that left her to fill in the blanks with shame. She had carried their words as if they were her own. But in her heart, she knew her story was not finished. Debt was part of it, yes, but it was not the whole. She began to wonder what it would feel like to write a new story, one where her identity was larger than the numbers on her statement. She opened her notebook once again. Instead of listing debts, expenses, or myths, she wrote the words, "Who am I beyond the loans?" The page stayed blank for a moment, then slowly she began to fill it. She wrote about her kindness. She wrote about the way she helped friends move apartments without being asked. She wrote about how she listened when people needed comfort. She wrote about her skills, the work she had done, the projects she had finished. None of these things could be measured in dollars, yet they defined her more clearly than any loan ever could. She remembered how debt had made her feel smaller in the past. It had told her she was behind, unworthy, irresponsible. But the truth she wrote on paper was different. She was resilient. She had learned how to manage, how to adapt, how to survive with less. She had learned discipline that many never had to practice. She realized that in many ways, debt had forced her to grow strong. That did not excuse the burden, but it did reveal hidden strengths inside her. She thought about the choices she wanted to make moving forward. In the past, she had delayed dreams because of the balance. She had told herself she would wait until the debt was gone to live fully. But she now knew waiting could steal decades. She wanted to create a new rule. She would live with balance, not in delay. She would pay what she could and still allow space for joy. She would not let the loans write her entire story. She began to picture small changes. Taking a short trip to the ocean, even if it was only for one night. Saving slowly for a new laptop that would help her work better. Allowing herself a special meal without guilt once in a while. Each of these choices said, "I am more than my debt." They were acts of reclaiming her life. She thought about the power of naming herself differently. Instead of calling herself a borrower, she could call herself a learner, a worker, or a builder. Instead of seeing her life as stuck, she could see it as unfolding. The words she used mattered. They shaped how she felt. She chose to speak gently about herself, the same way she wished others would speak to her. She remembered meeting a friend who had paid off their loans. The friend told her that freedom came not only from the final payment, but from deciding early on that the debt was not their identity. They had lived, grown, and celebrated along the way. The final zero was only one part of their story. She felt inspired by this. She realized that she did not have to wait for the end to feel free. Freedom could be a state of mind as much as a number on a page. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I am not my debt. I am not behind. I am enough today." Saying the words out loud made them feel real. She could feel her shoulders relax, as if the sentence itself lifted a part of the weight. She repeated it again, softer, until it became a lullaby she could carry into her sleep. Her notebook now contained more than balances and budgets. It contained truths, hopes, and new rules. It was becoming her storybook, a place where she could see herself clearly, not through the lens of shame, but through the lens of growth. She began to understand that healing her money story was as important as paying her money debt. The two were connected. One without the other would never bring full peace. She thought about the future. When the loans were finally gone, she wanted to look back and see not only struggle, but also resilience. She wanted her story to show that even in the years of debt, she lived, learned, and loved. That her worth was never measured by the numbers owed, but by the life she created despite them. That was the story she wanted to hand to her future self. Still, one more thought pressed gently at the edges of her mind. Even if she rewrote her story, even if she claimed her identity, she still needed something to hold on to in the long years ahead. A symbol of hope, a light that reminded her the tunnel had an end. She wondered what that light could be and how she could keep it glowing even in the darkest nights. And that is where the story will turn next. She had begun to rewrite her story. Her notebook no longer held only debts and budgets, and now carried her strengths, her hopes, and the gentle truth that she was more than a borrower. But as the days passed, she knew she needed more than words on a page. She needed something to hold on to when doubt returned. A light in the tunnel that could guide her through the long years of repayment. She sat at her desk and thought about what that light could be. For some people, it was the dream of a house. For others, it was the freedom to travel. For a few, it was simply the silence of being debt-free. She let herself picture each of those and asked what mattered most to her. Slowly, an answer formed. Her light would be peace. The peace of knowing her money was her own. The peace of sleeping without fear of emails or statements. The peace of choosing her life freely. She wrote it in her notebook. "My light is peace." She underlined it 3 times. Then she added smaller lights that would shine along the way, paying off one loan entirely. Reaching the point where her balance finally started to shrink, saving her first $1,000 in an emergency fund. These were milestones she could celebrate before the final freedom arrived. Each one was a candle in the tunnel, proof that she was moving forward. She remembered a story she had read about another borrower named Sarah. Sarah had been in debt for 20 years. Each month, she made payments that seemed endless, but she created a ritual. Every time she crossed a milestone, she lit a candle in her home and sat in silence for a few minutes, giving thanks for her progress. It became her way of seeing the light before the tunnel ended. That story stayed with her. She wanted to create her own ritual too. She decided that each time she made a payment, no matter how small, she would place a small stone in a jar on her desk. Over time, the jar would fill. Each stone would represent one step toward her light. When the jar was heavy, she would feel the weight of her progress in her hands. The loans might last for years, but her jar would remind her that she was not standing still. She also wanted to make her light visible in her daily life. So she wrote her affirmation on a card and taped it near her bed. It said, "I am walking toward peace." Each night before sleeping, she would read it aloud. Each morning when she awoke, it would be the first thing she saw. This small act gave her hope. Even when her balance felt unchanged, the words reminded her that the journey was not endless. She reflected on how important hope was in this process. Without hope, the loans felt like a prison. With hope, they became a path. Hope did not erase the debt, but it gave her energy to keep going. It kept her grounded when fear tried to take over. Hope was not a dream without action. It was a choice she made each day. She thought of her future self again, the version of her who had walked through the tunnel and reached the light. That self would look back and thank her for not giving up. That self would tell her the rituals mattered, the stones in the jar mattered, the small celebrations mattered. That self would be proud of every step she took. She smiled softly at the thought. As she prepared for bed that night, she lit a candle by her notebook. She whispered, "This light is mine. It will guide me." The flame flickered and filled the room with a warm glow. It was a small light, but it was enough to soften the shadows. It reminded her that even in the darkest moments, she could create her own brightness. Still, she knew her journey was not finished. She had named her light and chosen her rituals, but one final step remained. She wanted to tie all the lessons together. She wanted to gather every truth she had learned into one final reflection. She was ready to step into the last chapter of her story, where she would carry both knowledge and peace forward. And that is where her journey must go next. She had named her light. She had placed her rituals on the path ahead. The candle on her desk and the stones in the jar reminded her that progress could be seen and felt even when numbers seemed frozen. For the first time in years, she felt like she was not wandering in the dark. She was walking forward with steady steps. She opened her notebook one last time. The pages held her entire journey. The early lines showed balances and interest rates. Later, pages carried myths and the truths that replaced them. Some pages were filled with fear and shame. Others were filled with hope and new rules. She traced her finger across the paper and realized this book was more than notes. It was proof that she had faced her debt with courage. She thought about how far she had come. At the beginning, the loans had been a shadow she could not name. Each email had felt like a threat. Each statement had stolen her peace. Now she could see the system clearly. She knew the difference between subsidized and unsubsidized. She knew how interest grew. She knew the options when life interrupted payments. She knew how forgiveness worked, even with its limits. She had learned how to build a plan and how to carry hope. Knowledge had replaced confusion. That was a kind of freedom on its own. She remembered the nights when shame felt unbearable. The nights she believed she was behind everyone else. But she had learned that millions of people carried the same burden. She had seen that the problem was not her character, but the design of the system. That truth freed her from blame. She was not broken. She was human. She also thought about the family voices that had once weighed on her, the comparisons to another time, the judgments about choices. She had written her answers in her notebook and found peace. She could hold compassion for their stories while still honoring her own. The gap between generations was real, but it did not need to define herself. She now understood that debt was not only financial, it was emotional, physical, and social. It lived in sleepless nights, in racing thoughts, in quiet shame at gatherings. But she had also learned that healing was possible. Writing feelings down, speaking to friends, and practicing small rituals had all softened the weight. Healing did not wait for the last payment. Healing was part of the journey. She closed her eyes and pictured her future self again, the one who had finished the journey. That self stood in a quiet room holding the final statement with a zero balance. She imagined the tears in her eyes, the relief in her chest, the silence where the shadow once lived. That picture filled her with calm. It told her that even if the road was long, the end was real. She decided to write one final message to herself in her notebook. She wrote, "I am walking forward. I am allowed to rest. I am allowed to live. The debt is not my identity. It is only one chapter. My story is larger." She underlined the words and closed the book. She knew the balance would not vanish overnight. She knew there would still be months of frustration, moments of fear, and days when progress felt too slow. But she also knew she had the tools to keep walking. She had the light she had chosen. She had the rituals to remind her of progress. She had the strength to continue. The tunnel was long, but she no longer walked blind. She walked with clarity, with hope, and with peace in her heart. And as she drifted into sleep that night, she realized something powerful. The journey with money was not about perfection. It was about persistence, compassion, and steady steps. Still, one more part of her journey remained. She had faced the shadow, built her plan, and claimed her story. But now she wanted to step back and reflect on everything together. She wanted to gather all the lessons into one closing reflection that would let her rest fully. And that is where her story will end, in the soothing conclusion that waits ahead. The journey had stretched across many pages, many nights, and many lessons. What began as a shadow of fear had slowly turned into a path with light. She had carried confusion, shame, and exhaustion. Yet step by step, she had replaced those feelings with understanding, compassion, and quiet strength. Now, as the story comes to a close, she sits with her notebook in her lap and reflects on everything she has learned. She remembers how it started: the heavy emails, the impossible balances, the sleepless nights. She remembers the myths that told her she was weak, and the family voices that made her feel small. She remembers the moments she thought the loans would define her forever. But she also remembers the first time she wrote the balances in her notebook and saw the shadow shrink. That small act marked the beginning of change. She now understands the system in a way she never did before. She knows how subsidized loans stand still during school, while unsubsidized loans grow quietly. She knows how interest capitalizes and why balances feel like they rise faster than they fall. She knows the difference between deferment, forbearance, and default, and the ladders out of each one. She knows how forgiveness programs work, what their rules are, and why persistence matters. She no longer fears the unknown. She faces it with knowledge. She has also found ways to protect herself in daily life. She built a budget that holds both discipline and kindness. She gave herself permission to keep joy alive while paying. She used tools like autopay, apps, and small rituals to create steady progress. She learned that automation can remove worry and that tiny actions add up over time. Each of these steps gave her a sense of control. But more than money, she has healed the story inside her. She has faced the weight of anxiety, the shame of comparison, and the silence of judgment. She has written her truths on paper. She has spoken them aloud. She has built rituals of light, filling jars with stones and lighting candles to mark her progress. She has learned to call herself more than a borrower. She has named herself resilient, capable, and worthy. As she reflects, she sees the journey as more than a repayment plan. It has been a lesson in patience, in courage, and in compassion for herself. Debt may take years to leave, but peace does not have to wait. She can rest tonight, knowing that she has faced what once felt impossible. She can rest, knowing that every step, no matter how small, carries her closer to freedom. She closes her notebook one final time and whispers, "I am walking forward." The words echo in her chest like a soft lullaby. The debt is still there, but it is no longer the whole story. It is one chapter among many, and she is the author of what comes next. So tonight, you may rest as well. You have walked with her through the fear, the myths, the plans, and the hope. You have seen that money struggles are not a mark of weakness, but a shared human experience. You have seen that peace can be found even in the middle of repayment. As you lay your head down, remember this truth. You are more than the numbers in your account. You are more than the balance you owe. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to live while the journey continues. And tomorrow, when you wake, you will carry the calm of knowing your story is still being written. A story that can hold both responsibility and joy. A story where money is part of life, but never the whole of it. A story where you walk forward, step by step, toward peace. Tonight, let go of the weight for a while. Let your body soften, let your breathing slow, and let sleep carry you gently. You have done enough for today. You are enough. And the path ahead, long as it is, already has light waiting for you.